What constitutes a forever war? Welcome to the call. I'm Jay Sapsford. 4 years ago today, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was meant to be over in days. Instead, the war has helped reshape the world order. Peace talks have failed, and the conflict is reshuffling global alliances. So the question on this grim anniversary, how much longer will the war in Ukraine last? Joining us now is Andrea Kendall-Taylor, a former CIA analyst on Russia and Eurasia, and she is now Senior Fellow and Director of Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Andrea, welcome to the call.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Ukrainian President, in an interview, Volodymyr Zelensky, in an interview with the Financial Times, says Russia is playing games, unserious about ending the war. Is he right?
Well, I think yes and no. It's a complicated answer. It is clear that the Russians and Putin himself has given very little indication that he has an interest in ending the war. He hasn't backed away from any of his maximalist games. And so it is the case that it still looks like there will be no immediate end to the war. That said, I think this process of negotiations, the fact that the Russians and the Ukrainian side are in the room together, the fact that they have a political and military track to these discussions, they're working through important details and foundations of any agreement that will be reached in the future. Things like, how do we enforce a ceasefire? So even though there doesn't look like there's any immediate breakthrough on the horizon, I do still think that these talks are fruitful and are creating and laying the foundation for a future end to the war.
Okay, now, days before the 2022 invasion, you warned Congress that Putin was taking the biggest risk of his career and that there was ample room for him to miscalculate. Has he miscalculated? And what did he get right?
Well, I mean, clearly he has miscalculated because they thought they would take the capital Kyiv in 4 days, and now we're here at the 4-year mark. So there were a lot of faulty assumptions about how this war would play out. He underestimated very seriously Ukrainian resolve and the resolve of the West to support Ukraine. And so now we can see geopolitically, NATO is expanded. I think he is facing a much more concerning future as human capital has left the country. He has basically mortgaged down Russia's potential for growth and prosperity in the future on this risk. But I still think the rest of the story remains to be determined. It will very much matter how this war ends. And if he is successful in getting Ukraine to capitulate, which would be in large part because of a lack of kind of Western support and resolve to stay in this fight. But if he can win this war on terms that are favorable to Ukraine, then it may very well be the case that the risk was worth it from his perspective.
Now, Andrea, our producer, is putting up some visuals. First, a map of the battlefield shows that after years of fighting, Russia has advanced but secured only 20% of Ukrainian territory. Meantime, this chart also shows Moscow has paid a huge price for this limited success on the battlefield, with the Russian death toll reaching nearly 1.2 million, which leads to a crucial question. Is Russia exhausting itself?
That is a key. Just one correction. Those were not death toll, but casualties, which is an important distinction. But the point, nonetheless, is that any Russian gains have come at an exceptionally high cost to the Russians. And we are starting to see some signs that the war is getting more costly and difficult for the Russian side. As you know, we're basically coming to the end of winter. This has been an incredibly harsh and difficult winter for Ukrainians. But now that we're getting close to the end, there is this feeling in Ukraine like they've survived. They've made it through the winter, and they have held that front line. We're also seeing with the new Ukrainian Minister of Defense and the focus on technology, the Ukrainians are getting more lethal. They're beginning to kill more Russians. And for the first time in January, we saw that the Ukrainians killed more Russians than Russia was able to mobilize into the war. We're seeing more signs of economic stress and strain on the Russian side of the ledger. So I do believe that this war is getting more costly from the Russian perspective. And that's one reason I do think, again, although an end to the war is not imminent, I would say not through the summer. But when we start to get to the fall, my sense is that it is getting more plausible. The prospects that we could reach an end to the war are higher now than they've been before, in large part because Putin is beginning to recognize that he can't sustain this war indefinitely.
Well, thank you for the clarification on casualties. One of our members is asking, what is the appetite of the average Ukrainian to continue the fight? And is their appetite different by region?
I think that this is becoming a little bit of a polarized discussion inside Ukraine. Clearly, this has been one of the most difficult winters. It's been the coldest winter that Ukraine has faced, while Russia has had the most significant strikes on the electrical grid and other things. And so it has been a very, very brutal winter for Ukrainians. That said, when you look at the polling coming out of Ukraine, I think still many Ukrainians stand firm in this idea that they are not willing to give up territory that Ukraine holds, particularly if they don't know and understand the security guarantees that they would be receiving from the United States. So it's a little bit of a divided view, I think, amongst Ukrainians. Some don't want to go another winter like this and will be looking, if they can get the right security guarantees from the West, more appetite perhaps for making some of those territorial concessions if they can get the security guarantees that they need to know that Russia cannot try again in the future.
So why aren't more Ukrainians joining the fight? Is it this sense of fatigue that's starting to lay in? One of our members is curious to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different reasons. There's been historical reasons throughout the war where sometimes when units have been under-equipped and not having adequate ammunition and other things, the sense that young men were just kind of given a death sentence. That's another issue is once Ukrainians join the war, there isn't an immediate off-ramp to get out. So at this point in time, mobilization means that Ukrainians feel like they will spend the rest of their life in the Ukrainian military without a clear off-ramp. So there's all sorts of different reasons. Some units, those more successful units, better resourced units, are better able to attract people into the military. So there's a whole host of reasons. And, President Zelensky, I would say rightly, has been unwilling to lower the draft age in order to try to protect younger Ukrainians. I mean, it is the grim reality that with casualties as high as are in such a smaller country relative to the Russian side, that they're going to have young men and young women in order to remain a viable country in the future. And so President Zelensky has guarded that younger population, not willing to lower that draft age to mobilize younger Ukrainians into the war.
All right, looking back at the Russian side here, another member is asking, Russian manufacturing growth is slowing. The IMF cut Russia's growth forecast to 1% and it's running out of armored vehicles. Can Russia actually lose its own war of attrition?
People who I look to, economists looking at the Russian economy, Alexandra Propenko has written a really wonderful article in The Economist where she talks about the Russian economy and gives an analogy of mountain climbing, where the Russian economy has basically entered what climbers would call it the death zone, where the Russian economy now has to consume itself in order for the country to stay alive. So it is the low growth rate, high inflation. Another big issue, the wages in the defense sector are taking employees from the non-defense industries and moving them into the defense-related industries. So production in non-defense related industries have gone down. And all of the kind of innovation, ability to access technology, the Russian economy really is consuming itself in order to sustain this war. But the problem is that Russia then also looks at challenges that Ukraine is having, wondering if allies and partners are going to be able to stay in this war. One major issue on the Ukrainian side is their electrical grid, and whether or not Ukraine will be able to repair that electrical grid such that Ukrainians will be willing to tolerate another winter in Ukraine. There are challenges on both sides of the equation, and right now Putin is making the calculation that although their economy is hurting, that they still can outlast Ukraine and the West. And so for that reason, even though they are having these economic challenges, the economy alone is not going to be the thing to change Putin's calculus on the war.
Well, that raises the question, is a weaker Russia even more of a threat? I mean, we're seeing growing Russian sabotage operations, not only in Europe, but across Europe. We have NATO intercepts of drone harassments and that sort of thing. I just wonder, for the European calculation on this, does the fact that Russia's economy now seems to be slowing actually make the situation even more dire?
Well, I think, important kind of piece of context, the Russian economy is hurting, but they are prioritizing the military and defense spending.
Mm.
So Russian defense spending still remains at something like 8% of its overall GDP. And Russia has committed to growing the military to 1.5 million. So Russia is likely to end this war with a larger military than when they began. Despite all of the sanctions and the economic troubles on things like drones, ammunition, long-range missiles, Russia has been able to actually increase its production of these things. So Russians, while the economy is hurting for ordinary, everyday Russians, the Russian state continues to prioritize the military dimension. And so it means, to your point correctly, that the threat that Russia poses will not go away because of these economic challenges that it faces, and they're on a wartime footing, and they are committed to reconstituting the military as quickly as possible.
Okay, in several places, we've spoken about Europe's window of vulnerability when it comes to the war, that even if the war ends, there's still going to be risks there. I wonder if you could just walk us through what you were talking about with that.
Well, the point that you made about how the war ends is one of the most important factors, I think, in dictating the nature of the Russian challenge that Europe will face.
Mm.
And if Russia is able to end this war with a subjugated Ukraine, with a Ukrainian military that has significant caps on its size and its capabilities, then Russia will be free to redeploy those resources that are tied up in Ukraine in other places, and it will constitute a much more significant threat. They've also learned lessons from Ukraine that makes them, I think, a more formidable challenge than they would have been even 4 years ago. So that is the crux of the problem, that the Russian military will remain a persistent threat. They are rapidly racing to reconstitute their military, and they are watching very closely what the Europeans are doing. Yes, Europe has made tremendous commitments to spend 5% of GDP to grow their militaries. But the problem is that's going to take many years for Europe to develop the capabilities that they need to defend themselves, especially as the United States is withdrawing support. And that creates the window that you're talking about. Russia is a formidable force, but the European militaries are not yet where they need to be. And I think Putin understands that window of opportunity very well, such that once this war ends, I think there is this kind of 10-year window where the risk of further Russian aggression will be greatest.
I'm going to put together two questions now from our members. Can Europe effectively deter Russia when it still relies on Russian oil and gas? And today is also the 10th anniversary of the first U.S. LNG cargo being shipped. How important has the advent of U.S. LNG exports been to the EU's diversification from Russian gas?
Well, I think that it's been tremendous. It has been one of the big factors that it has enabled Europe to so significantly diversify its energy supply away from Russia. There definitely are still countries, particularly in Central Europe, Hungary, the Slovaks, and others that still rely somewhat on Russian energy. But the EU member states have pledged to rapidly to fully reduce and cut their dependence on Russian oil and gas in the future. So we're looking at a totally different energy landscape in Europe today than we had previously, and that certainly makes Europe a whole lot less vulnerable than it used to be to Russian aggression.
All right, we're putting up another chart showing the countries with the top tech companies when measured by market cap. You can see the US, China, and Japan dominate the rankings, but Russia doesn't even register. And yet, despite sanctions, Russia has kept pace with Ukraine's battlefield innovations. Where is Russia getting all this technology?
It's such a great question. China was number two. And I think one of the big headlines of this war in Ukraine has been the deepening relationship between Russia and China, but also Iran and North Korea, what I've referred to as the axis of upheaval. And since this war began, Russia has significantly deepened partnerships with all of these countries. So initially, Russia received the very significant influx of the Shahed drones from Iran, and they continue to access from China things like all of the chips, the component parts, dual-use goods. Russia is essentially able to access the technology that has been cut off from the West in China and some of these other countries. And so the moral of the story there is by deepening these relationships, this axis of upheaval has made Russia far less isolated and vulnerable to Western pressure. It's made them far more resilient, and China really has been the essential lifeline to Russia that's enabled them to sustain the war in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, and in particular by providing the technology and the components that Russia needs to invest in its drones and other technology that we're seeing on the battlefield.
Another member is asking, we see reports that some intercepted Russian drones have Western technology. What does that say about export controls as a tool of statecraft?
Yeah, so I mean, it's such a good and important question because it is the unfortunate reality that despite all of the export controls and all of the sanctions, that Russia has been exceptionally effective at circumventing those restrictions. They've been able to, and a lot of the Western technology, for example, we've seen the exports from Germany to, say, Kazakhstan, for example, more than triple or quadruple over the course of the war. And then Russia is able to then have those imports come from Kazakhstan. So they found all sorts of innovative ways to circumvent those export controls. And so the moral of the story to me is, of course, the export controls are really important, but the United States and especially our European allies need to invest far more resources in strengthening the enforcement of those export controls and sanctions.
Imagine all that investment that's going to be required of Europe. There's going to be significant opportunities for the U.S. defense industrial base since they rely on us for probably more than half of their hardware at this point, right?
So for that trade relationship, I think will continue to be really important. The thing that's happening in Europe, though, are these major concerns that the United States is not a reliable partner. And so they've looked at, obviously, U.S. threats to attack Greenland. But, earlier in the war, early on in the Trump administration, there was a period of time where the United States cut intelligence support to Ukraine, and that was very costly for the Ukrainians. And so you have a lot of Europeans, particularly on the eastern flank, asking, well, if we were in a time of need, would the United States cut support to us? And so there are some strands in the European discourse, particularly coming from France and the Buy Europe push, that these countries are questioning the reliability of the United States. And so this is an ongoing debate about how Europe is going to fulfill the requirements that are needed in order to rapidly increase their capabilities. Can they do it on their own more autonomously, or how much of that is going to come from the United States? Last thing I'll say is part of it is going to need to come from the United States because they don't have the defense industrial base to ramp up as quickly as would be required. And many of those technologies, air defenses and other things, they will need the United States for until they can get their own kind of indigenous technologies in place.
Now, as we wrap up here, Andrea, I'd like to note that you've spent your career looking at strongmen and autocracies. What's the one thing to watch over the next 12 months that might signal a significant shift in Putin's strategy, or what might bring him to the table to end this war?
Oh, you saved the hardest question for last. And I guess I'll just end by saying, when you look objectively at what's happening, we talked about the strains on the Ukrainian economy. We've talked about the increasing strains on the Russian economy, the increasing lethality of the Ukrainians and ability to kill more Russians more quickly than they could mobilize. Putin is also looking at this U.S. administration and probably wondering if this is the best deal that they will be able to get. The Trump administration obviously talking about wanting to normalize relations with Russia. A lot of economic deals are being discussed between the two sides. And so the question would be, whether or not Putin will see this as the best deal possible that Russia will be able to get. I, looking at it objectively, think that the prospects of the war ending have gone up significantly. But the problem is, just as you said, Jay, it really comes down to the decision of one man. And I think understanding and his calculus has been very difficult. He isn't necessarily the rational actor that we've understood in the past. And so trying to judge when he will believe that the war can't be sustained indefinitely is the primary challenge. And it's really difficult to assess when he will be willing to end the war.
All right. Well, we deeply appreciate you joining us today to unpack such a complex war that continues to change and influence the global world order. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, former senior CIA analyst and now senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at CNAS, thank you so much for swinging by today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, our audience has had their shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. Next week, we'll be joined by Corey Shockey, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, to discuss the source of American power. Missed a live episode? Well, catch the replay on our website, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. You can also listen to the call's podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.